I'd like to introduce our first speaker, if he's ready, Dr. Richter. So Dr. Stephen Richter is a professor of biology and also the director of the Division of Natural Areas at Eastern Kentucky University. And he will be speaking about the importance of upland embedded wetlands in conservation management. And so Dr. Richter, if you're ready.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay and see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, thanks, Matt. All right, well, I was asked to develop a talk that focused on species that use wetlands, why wetlands are important for wildlife, and the role that constructed wetlands can play. So probably going to focus on why it matters how constructed wetlands are built and then how they function, and mostly focusing on amphibians, although I'll mention other species as well. So before I start, though, I saw there are some students in here, and just as a kind of flashback to my master's days in the mid-90s, I began as a fairly naive graduate student, and I worked in wetland systems on the forest in Mississippi, the DeSoto National Forest. Worked closely with the Forest Service, even I guess was allowed to help with burns, although I wasn't trained. Many of you students now can get trained to do controlled burns. I was allowed to use a longleaf pine branch to beat the fire back as it got close to our drift fence. But those experiences had a huge impact on what I became, what I wanted to do, really helped me to understand what I loved. So I highly recommend those research and management opportunities that if you can get access to those as students. I'm going to start with thanks, and I apologize to students I didn't list here, but a whole bunch of undergraduates and graduate students have been involved with these projects that I'll talk about. Blue are geoscience students, green are biology or wildlife, lots of funding sources. Tom Biebighauser, who is a global wetland creator and restorer, but he was the biologist on the Daniel Boone Cumberland Ranger District. Well, we began this work back in 2007, and then other colleagues, Dr. Kelly Watson and Jonathan Malzone from the geosciences, and Dr. Luke Dodd, working with bats and insects I'll talk about from the biology department. And then Christy Wampler, who's the current biologist and has been a great colleague through the years in helping us develop ideas and support them. So I'm going to start by saying that most of you, all of you know what wetlands are, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. Wetland, it's not land, it's not water, it's sort of both. But they have really important functions, and both physical, chemical, and biological, and I'm not going to go through them like I said, but mostly today I'm going to focus on the biological functions, although I'll mention the physical as well. If you're interested in Kentucky wetlands, there are lots of good sources out there, but I'll recommend this. Some of us at EKU wrote a chapter about wetlands of Kentucky from the Appalachians to the Mississippi floodplains and how they connect landscapes and waterways. So also, as everyone's aware, we've lost a lot of our wetlands. These are images from Kentucky where they've been ditched, drained, tiled, filled for agriculture and development. Leading to us being a leader in wetland loss, unfortunately, over 80% of our wetlands having been lost. So as a consequence, those wetland creation as management and as mitigation for that loss, depending on the agency, it depends on whether it's for wildlife management or actual regulatory process. And for those that do remain on the landscape, often they need to be restored. They've been impacted, so that's key, but even more key is those that remain we need to preserve. So that's all about this sort of thing. I'm going to focus now mostly on the use of constructed wetlands in management, a little bit about restoration as well. So the upland embedded term I used on my cover slide, I didn't mention at all. You've heard these called upland pools, wildlife ponds, vernal pools, geographically isolated wetlands, sometimes just isolated wetlands. And that term is really misleading. It's talking about wetlands that are completely surrounded by uplands, but they aren't geographically isolated from, it's hard to know what that even means. They're also not hydrologically isolated. They do sometimes have groundwater. They're connected, although they may not be connected to a stream or river. Their hydrology is driven by rain or precipitation, surface runoff, and sometimes groundwater. So that term, isolated wetlands, is really a misnomer. We published a paper we couldn't strongly recommend the use of upland embedded wetlands as the term, because there were US EPA, US Fish and Wildlife, USGS scientists on the paper, so they weren't allowed to recommend changing a term that's used in regulation like geographically isolated wetlands, but we strongly encourage the use of upland embedded wetlands. So that's why I call them that. That's why I'll continue to. It's a mouthful, but they're incredibly important habitats for lots of organisms and other functions on the landscape. We'll see those. Some of you may have been to Booth Pond before. This is an example of an upland embedded wetland. Here's another one that's on Burnt Ridge Road in Jackson County. This is another one. You go into the woods and find these stained leaves and evidence of some moist soils. This one is at Central Kentucky Wildlife Management Area during the winter time, and as the winter rains come, they begin to fill. They hold water through spring into summer typically and dry. And so why focus on upland embedded wetlands? Well, I think my main reason is they're the coolest wetland. Kind of biased, but I guess from a more factual basis, they're not protected typically. I'm not going to get into the Clean Water Act versus the waters of the US, but they're currently not protected at the federal level, and most states don't have protection for them. Yet they're the most vulnerable to removal because they don't connect to streams. They're not typically in lowland areas. They're a little easier to remove from the landscape or modify. To replace them, constructing wetlands that hold water is pretty straightforward, especially if you're in lowlands, but in many cases those hydrologies are permanent, and trying to get them to dry, these targeting specific hydroperiods, is really difficult. So the system I'll talk about, we're moving toward trying to figure out how to target those hydroperiods. So first, because amphibians are the kind of the players in this as indicator species, let's talk about them a little. Those that breed in water bodies, at least, all of them have a biphasic life cycle. So they have an aquatic egg and larva, metamorphosis into the terrestrial habitat. There's one salamander that has terrestrial eggs, but still has larval aquatic larvae and metamorphosis. So they use both the wetland and the upland. Those amphibians that breed in wetlands, here are they from eastern Kentucky, and we'll look at them, their preferences here in just a second. But here's another wetland. This is one that was constructed unintentionally. Actually, it was created by off-road vehicles, and it dries. Why is that important? So I keep saying not permanent or targeting hydroperiods. Why is that an important consideration? Let's go back to amphibian life history again, and I'm going to make some really broad generalizations. I don't think I saw John McGregor on here, so maybe I'm safe from criticism. We'll see. I might overgeneralize, but in general, those that breed in temporary water versus permanent water, I'm going to differentiate. So those that breed in temporary water tend to spend more time on the uplands as adults. Those that breed in permanent tend to remain near water. You can see when they breed differently, winter to spring versus summer. Temporary water, they have rapid larval growth because they need to emerge before the wetland dries. Those in permanent water can stay in longer, some even overwinter. Juveniles tend to emerge in the summer as the wetland dries for temporary, and then if they overwinter, they might emerge in the following spring, or they could emerge in that fall. The last two I'm going to combine is predators and disease, and this is where it's a little more generalized, that in general, that because the wetland holds water longer, in permanent water sources, the amphibians that have developed there through evolutionary processes have a higher defense against predators and diseases, because those two can persist in that aquatic ecosystem year-round. So when their eggs are laid, as they begin developing, they're being exposed to those, whereas those that breed in temporary water, many of them breed when the wetlands are filling, and so their resistance to diseases and also their defense against predators isn't as great. So back to those amphibians of eastern Kentucky. These are salamanders that breed in temporary waters, typically four-toed and marbled. Frogs that breed in temporary, mountain chorus frogs, wood frogs, and spadefoot. Salamanders that breed in permanent, frogs that breed in permanent. And then the others do one or the other. They might prefer more ephemeral or more permanent, but they can breed in either type of wetland. So this will become important in just a little bit. So as I said, we focus most of our work in the Daniel Boone National Forest, shown there in green, mostly in the northern part from the gorge to Moorhead, but some into Jackson and Laurel counties. Over 800 wetlands have been constructed on ridges in the Daniel Boone for habitat enhancement, not part of the regulatory process. Most of them were constructed initially for deer and turkey because the natural wetlands were dry in the summer, so these were meant to be permanent, and later for bats. But few of them have been monitored. And this is an example topographic map of the Dark Cave wetland system, and you can see some of these areas you're walking along sheer cliff faces on both sides to a upland that ridgetop that widens out, and then you find these really cool wetlands on top. And the views from them, it's just a really cool, spectacular ecosystem to work in. Here's some images. This is one of those Dark Cave wetlands. This is the smallest of the wetlands we know of the naturals. It's been impacted. It's next to a gas line, but it still functions and mostly as a natural. It is natural. And here are some of the constructed wetlands. So initially they were built with these really high dams. They're bowl-shaped, they're deep, not much aquatic plant life. But if the goal is to provide permanent water to wildlife, then this makes sense why they look this way. Tom Biebighauser began really honing his skills for having these wetlands appear to be more natural in terms of their habitat complexity, down woody debris, the plant communities, the depths, the differences in depths, and so on. So our general research objectives, given the history of management and the philosophy for the wetland management of permanent water sources, what are the unintended consequences for that original management for non-game species? Amphibians, insects, bats, and plants are what we've focused on so far. And I know bats were part of that original management practice, so I guess ignore that unintended consequence for them, but the others weren't being targeted. And then a little bit about what drives the hydrology of constructed and natural wetlands. So I'm going to summarize plants really quickly because everyone that's done any work with plants, and especially in wetlands, knows that you can predict kind of what plants would be in which wetland type, depending on whether the hydrology is permanent or not. And there were distinct differences, and it all has to do with their hydrophilic, hydrophobic, whether they're obligate wetland, facultative upland, facultative wetland, so on. Plants, we found more obligate plants in permanent wetlands as predicted. So I'm not going to talk in detail about that, but Dr. Kelly Watson is going to be looking at more detailed processes and patterns for plants in these wetlands next year. In terms of bats, collaborating with Dr. Watson and Dr. Luke Dodd, we did some initial work to ask if there are differences in bat communities, and the question mark is there because the data suggest that there is a difference, but these are preliminary data. These are nightly passes of myotis bats, so ones that are more predisposed to white nose or affected by white nose, and they tended to have more nightly passes in natural wetlands than constructed, due in part potentially to the hydrology, but also to the vegetative cover. If they're scatter, they prefer understory, and so there's some relationship between vegetation and bats as well. And so Luke and Kelly are mentoring Brittany Ryan, a graduate student that actually worked as an undergrad on this project and a related project with insects to really tease this apart. So we should know more about bats soon. I'm not a chiropterologist. I had to look that up, Luke. Or a botanist, so let's go back to amphibians. I'm in my comfort zone. So we use standardized techniques to monitor amphibian populations, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly for time, but basically we use standardized techniques for the amphibians, dip netting and minnow trapping, and also collected lots of data in the wetland and around the wetland, factors that affect amphibians and wetland condition. And what we found is, not surprisingly, don't worry about this redundancy analysis graph, other than to see that old constructed wetlands are really similar, and they are all in the deep and longer hydro period side. Makes sense. They were meant to be permanent, and they should be really similar because they had a good technique down. The newer constructed that I showed you images of had more variation in them. Some of them grouped with the naturals, some of them grouped with the older constructed, but just like the naturals that have a lot of variability, they show that as well. We can also overlay on this the amphibians. I'm just going to skip this. You can see, if you know your scientific names, wood frogs, newts, bullfrogs, green frogs, grouping as you would think along those gradients. But we can look at percentages of each and whether they were found in permanent wetlands or ephemeral. And you can see wood frogs primarily were found in ephemeral, and the ones we predict, bullfrogs, green frogs, and newts in permanent wetlands. And then the other species sort of fell out, again, based on their life history, as we would predict. But beyond that, we wanted to look at diseases in survival in constructeds, because although we didn't find many wood frog larvae in constructed wetlands, we did find a few, and so we want to know what the mechanisms are driving those patterns of where things are found. And so we looked at survival of four-toed salamanders and wood frogs. I'm going to focus just on the wood frogs. I was on sabbatical, and we had only found a few larvae in constructed wetlands, but I went out in winter before they hatched, and this is a constructed wetland with 95 wood frog clutches in it. So I was baffled. We'd never seen anything like this, confused, but if you zoom in, and some of you have seen this before, but there are about 11 newts in this image, and what they're doing, you can see they're consuming the eggs, and over a 4.5 week period, all of the eggs were eaten, and these sausage-like newts are sort of half floating, half swimming around after consuming 95,000 eggs as a group. Just down from there, 250 meters away, this is a natural wetland. That's a raft of wood frog eggs, and on it are lots of hatchling wood frog embryos that are just like the perfect food packet for a newt. No bones, lots of nutrients, still have some yolk. And so a student came and looked and quantified this, and this shows the number of larvae, later stage larvae found in wetlands. In natural, much greater than 0 in constructeds, and the number of newts that were found in each. You can see the stark difference. We looked at body mass or body condition, and you can see it, but newts in wetlands that had wood frogs had much greater body condition than those that didn't. So permanent wetlands at high densities, at least on the landscape, can exclude reproductive success. You see that in wood frogs. We also looked at diseases. We need to look closer at this, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but the overall outcome of this is that there are unnaturally elevated abundances of these species because of the presence of the constructed wetlands. They're competitors, they're predators, they're disease vectors, and we're still learning what effect they have on ecosystems. So some conclusions. Bat, plant, and amphibian species are higher at constructed wetlands in terms of their richness. However, natural wetlands provide habitat for species of conservation need, bats, and those that require seasonal hydrology, amphibians and plants. And constructed wetlands allow species that are historically absent or much lower abundance, like in amphibians and plants, those that wouldn't be there if the permanent wetlands weren't present. High species richness does not equate to reference conditions. That's an important point. These constructed upland embedded wetlands have a disturbance history, and most have a permanent hydrology that promote invasive species. So we started looking at hydrology and got Claudia Cotton involved, soil geologist, asking if modify the management needs to be done, and Jonathan Malzone has been involved from the geosciences, geohydrologist. He recently left EKU, but Tyler Mahoney, just hired at U of L, is getting involved. So I'm not going to talk too much about the hydrogeology data other than to say this wetland, which is permanent, Jonathan, based on all of his data collected at Natural and Constructeds, came up with a technique of sand and ditches to lower the hydrology of this permanent wetland, hopefully for it to dry. And you can see on this pipe, this well, this is the historic water level of the wetland, and it's lower, much lower, which is a good sign that it's working, but that research is still continuing. Kelly, Dr. Watson is getting involved with finding new wetlands using LIDAR. So this is something that the algorithm found. She went out in field, tested it. There's actually a natural wetland in that spot, and there were wood frogs eggs in it. Let's see, I have 5 minutes. All right, I'm going to wrap up with one last point. So the data that I showed you were collected in an area where really high constructed densities relative to natural. So in this example, those are all, blue are the constructed wetlands, and the natural are shown in aqua. So that's a high density area of constructeds. If we look in an area with low density of constructeds compared to naturals, we find a different story. So this is the reminder of the high density. Newt local abundance is high, Newton wood frog coexistence is low or absent. If we look at constructed wetlands in low density areas, these are spotted and Jefferson salamanders that do better in constructed permanent wetlands. Wood frogs that do best in natural ephemeral but do exist in constructed permanent. Newts, which are at a low density, different from the high density of constructeds. They're in low abundance in this system. And most importantly is, interestingly, wood frogs and newts can coexist when wetland densities are less. So the point of that is that sometimes it's the densities, not necessarily the hydrology or some combination of those. So these should be created as a last resort. The distribution of them needs to be considered, the natural distribution historically. And then management goals need to be defined, endpoints of success determined using natural wetlands as a reference, not just presence and absence of species, because we would have been totally wrong if we'd just used that, and then continuing to monitor and reworking the wetlands if needed through this adaptive management approach. So I'm going to end with this idea that in wooded systems, that's what I was talking about, that if you're getting into lowland wetland systems where the hydrology is very different and the natural wetlands don't dry, then you need to think a little bit differently about how the wetlands are created and still having complexity, but maybe areas that are permanent and others that dry down throughout the year. So I'll end there for questions, and maybe, let me stop sharing my screen.